Hey everyone, I'm Andy, International Tax Advisor since 2014, Chartered Accountant since 2018, and on this channel I help you navigate the complex world of international tax. In today's video, I'm going to be taking you through the main reason why your employer might not want you to work remotely from a different country. So I saw this funny tweet the other day where basically a UK person who has a UK employer, works remotely, basically said that actually I haven't been honest with my employer. I've been living in Greece for the past 6 months. I've been logging in through a VPN. I just tell them I'm in the UK. And this was funny, but also sparked a little bit of comment, some curiosity or debate over, is this actually legal, or am I breaking any sort of tax rules or whatever. And there's a lot of confusion because this can be extremely complicated and very case dependent. But it also pertains to a kind of wider point and a wider question that a lot of people have been asking since the pandemic and since the rise of remote work. People are asking, if I can work remotely throughout my own country, why can't I just do that somewhere else in a separate country? So for example, I speak to a lot of people who work remotely in the US and they want to go to Mexico or South America because time zones are same, they can get their work done, but they'd rather live somewhere else. Similarly, a lot of UK people saying, I'd love to work remotely in Spain or Italy or somewhere like that. And yeah, it's just been a very common question and an area where people would love to explore, but it also seems to be quite common for employers to flat out ban it as a possibility. And this leaves a lot of people asking questions, why, what's the main problem, or if there is a main problem, can you at least expand on how I might be able to get over it and mitigate that as a risk. So I think just to get into it really in this video, I'd like to kind of just touch on what is the main concern from the employer perspective, and potentially if you can address that, you might be able to find a way to do it. But yeah, I think just addressing why it is the case is important. So of course, every company is different. There can be lots of different reasons why they feel uncomfortable about remote workers leaving the country. It could be legal, it could be logistical. But by far and away, the number one concern, I see this amongst all of my clients that have remote workers, and just generally speaking from what I know about the kind of global tax landscape, the number one concern is corporate tax. And basically, just to illustrate at a high level, corporate tax is the tax that companies pay on their corporate profits. So for example, in the UK, you'll be paying somewhere between 19 to 25% on your profits, depending on the size of the profits. In the US, you'll be paying at least 21%, could be higher depending on what state you're in. And generally speaking, unless we're talking about tax havens, you're going to be paying at least 15% on corporate profits, and sometimes it can be more than 30%, just depending on what your country is. So of course, corporate tax therefore makes a huge percentage of a company's costs, and so it is very, very important to manage this appropriately. And in itself, it can be quite a complex area to dive into from a tax point of view. And so, well, what happens with corporate taxes then when you have remote workers? Well, generally speaking, a company does pay corporate taxes on where it's incorporated. So, let's say we have a UK limited company and, it's got UK staff and staff all around the world. The first port of call is that you look at, the residency of the company, where was it incorporated? And so it will be paying UK corporate taxes. But your potential chargeability to corporate tax doesn't always end there, especially when you have a kind of international company or international presence. So whilst a very simple UK company with only UK-based employees and UK operations will just have a UK corporate tax liability, once you start to expand globally and you have physical presence or potentially staff in different countries, you then open up the possibility that perhaps in these different countries you might have what's known as a permanent establishment. So under international tax law and under the domestic law of many countries, they have a description of what's known as a permanent establishment in their country. And broadly speaking, if you have a permanent establishment in that country, then you will owe corporate taxes based on the profits attributed to that permanent establishment. So how can you create a permanent establishment in another country? Well, there's two main ways in most domestic tax law and also double tax treaties, and we can go into double tax treaties later as well. These are basically bilateral agreements which certain countries agree with each other on how to police the tax rules between themselves. But basically, permanent establishment can be created by either having a physical presence. So for example, this could be a warehouse, it could be an office, it could be something that's physical and tangible and has a real physical presence in that country. Or you can have a permanent establishment with what's known as a dependent agent. So a dependent agent is someone who works on the company's behalf, regularly negotiates or concludes contracts on behalf of the company, and really plays a significant role in the company's operations, moving the company forward, and perhaps even negotiates with people on the ground in that country, and generally speaking is a significant part of that company when they are working abroad. And so just stepping back, fixed place of business is one type of permanent establishment, going back to the kind of physical presence, or a dependent agent is the other kind of permanent establishment, which often are the two main ways in which a permanent establishment could be caused. And so if we go back to the original tweet in this example, we have an employee from the UK who is working in Greece on behalf of the company, and they've not declared that to their employer, but the Greek side of things might say, well, you don't have a physical presence here, okay, maybe you don't have a full-time office or a warehouse, but what you do have is potentially a dependent agent, because you've got someone who's in Greece. They might be concluding contracts in Greece, they might be advancing the company from that perspective whilst they're in Greece, and the Greek tax law may well judge that essentially this UK company now has a dependent agent permanent establishment in Greece. And so what does that mean? Well, it now means that instead of just having to file UK corporate tax returns, this company has now inadvertently created an obligation to file Greek tax returns. And assuming that they're in the UK, they don't have any Greek tax specific experts or anyone in their bookkeeping or tax teams to help them out with that, they're going to have to draft in experts, they're going to have to draft in professionals in Greece to ensure that they are meeting their tax obligations within Greece, all just because one employee has basically decided to relocate and live in Greece. So this can be extremely complicated, especially when you have a dependent agent who concludes significant contracts and deals. Generally speaking, the lower the level of staff, potentially the less important or less significant their presence in that separate country could be. If you've got a certain member of staff who might be just doing a purely administrative role, then there may be an argument that there isn't a significant revenue driver there, there's not a significant dependent agent, they're not concluding contracts. There could be an argument for some staff that actually there is no permanent establishment. However, when you're talking about C-suite executives, when you're talking about directors, when you're talking about heads of department, if they're in Greece or wherever else outside the incorporation country, well, then the permanent establishment really, you're getting on the borderline of potentially triggering that, and therefore creating a tax liability. So in later videos I'll go into real specifics, because as I said, every single country has their own interpretation of the tax law as it pertains to permanent establishments, as it pertains to residency of the company, and how permanent establishments are treated. But as a general rule, you can create a permanent establishment via a fixed place of business or a dependent agent. And this is the real worry with remote workers, is that you could be creating a permanent establishment with your remote staff. That requires you then to create basically a corporate tax return in that country, basically until that staff member leaves. And if you think about it, when you have a UK company that suddenly now has, maybe they've let it run free and they've now started to let all their staff basically travel to carry out their work. Well, you could have a very serious situation. Let's say you've got 100 staff and they're all over the globe. Maybe they're in various countries in Europe, maybe some of them in South America, some of them in Asia. You could have the possibility that you now have you may have hundreds of corporate tax returns to fill in because of the permanent establishment situation. Now, that's obviously an extreme example and possibly a remote possibility from the perspective of that many, but it is theoretically possible. And again, this theoretical possibility is what makes companies nervous. So generally, if you do want to, mitigate this, there's a lot of things you can think about. But first of all, it's really establishing that you don't have a permanent establishment throughout your activities. You'd have to look at the local tax law as it pertains to your activities. Make sure that the local tax law does not trigger a corporate residence, doesn't trigger a permanent establishment, and also look at the double tax treaty between the country you're living in and the country of your employer's incorporation. So for example, here we're talking about the double tax treaty between the UK and Greece. So you'd have to look at this, you'd have to establish, what does the local permanent establishment say, what does the law say in that perspective, or what does the double tax treaty say in terms of what creates a permanent establishment. So you need to look at both, and again, this gets extremely complicated. If you do look at both, you look at your own situation and you confirm, actually, we're not creating a permanent establishment. There can be ways in which you can make your employer comfortable to say, the risk isn't actually there and we will be fine. So to sum up, it really is all about corporate tax and the potential creation of a permanent establishment. And so a lot of companies will just flat out say, it's too much of a risk, we're not going to entertain the possibility, and we just don't want you to work remote. We don't even want to think about how to mitigate the potential. We're just going to flat out ban it. And then there's the other companies that might be a little bit more flexible that will say, well, if you can do this, if you can follow these steps, if you can assure us on this, then we might be able to allow it. But that's basically it. And yeah, I mean, it's a complex area. It's highly specific to the countries in question as well. Often will require consulting multiple different tax laws as well as double tax treaties, and just assessing case by case what the facts on the ground are, what the facts of the employee's situation are, and basically how that relates to the interpretation of the tax law. So it can get complex, but it's not an insurmountable area, and it is still a possibility for workers to do this, but there are a lot of hurdles to navigate, and it is important to just be sure that everything has been kind of touched on, make sure everything's been consulted and followed appropriately. But for now, hopefully this was a useful overview. If you've got any comments or questions, any areas you want me to expand on, just give me a shout in the comments below. Cheers.